Hello everyone. I'm here at the San Francisco Botanical Gardens again, and this is the entrance cedar. Yesterday the hive here suddenly woke to life, and yesterday or today the hive outside the garden, let's see here, make sure I get this, make sure I capture this on the camera. Yeah, yesterday or today the hive outside the garden also woke to life after both of these hives being apparently completely dormant for quite some time. Certainly the weather in San Francisco has been different this year than for many previous years, but I've never seen these hives go dormant, and it was very surprising to me. I couldn't really tell whether they're dormant or they had been evacuated or they had died. It wasn't really clear, though I occasionally saw one or two bees near the hive inside the garden, the one we just looked at. Yesterday, for the first time, the inner hive was quite busy. And today, as I approached the garden, I noticed that the outer hive was also very active. I've had a number of topics on my mind lately, although I haven't been able to make a video. And I'm going to try to cover two of those topics this afternoon because they're related. And these are topics that I've broached in previous recent videos. But not fully covered. The sun is very bright in my eyes at the moment. And the scent of the flowering trees this time of year in the garden is quite profound. This garden has one of the premier collections of magnolias in the world, and they are blossoming. Interestingly, we have these trees completely covered with flowers. Yeah. And the scent is incredible. But I don't recall ever seeing bees. I don't recall ever seeing bees tending these flowers. And if I understand it correctly, the magnolias are nocturnal pollinators. I mean, they're nocturnally pollinated where they come from. And so the creatures that pollinate them don't exist here. Although it's conceivable that there are nocturnal pollinator insects relating with the magnolias. Again, I've seen no evidence of this, and I'm relatively doubtful that this is happening. So, although we have these vast flowering trees here, that produce an incredible perfume, particularly in the evenings, it appears that they are very lonely and their natural pollinators are missing. I just want to show the dawn redwoods, the Metasequoia glyptostroboides. These were damaged by a tree fall, which you can see here last year. It remains to be seen to what degree some of them will recover. I think this really large one, the oldest of the 4 here, will probably be fine. It's unclear how these ones will fare, but shortly we will see. And some of the other dawn redwoods in the vicinity are already producing greenery. They are the deciduous ancestors of the redwood trees, and they're beautiful. Their trunks are gorgeous and kind of spooky. These are one of the trees that would produce pareidolia, if I've got that pronunciation correct. And there's another really beautiful phenomenon here. These ferns are emerging gloriously, and they're amazingly sophisticated organisms. Love them. So the 2 topics that I'm hoping to reflect on today are the nature of our minds, and also the nature of what we brought to human birth that preceded the instancing of an enlanguaged, enculturated human mind. The precursor intelligence that infants have. And it's clear that many animals have some analog of this. And part of the reason that it's clear is that these animals often, these will be social organisms, can be observed to play. Now, the questions about the nature of minds run very, very deep. And we don't have the answers. I've been curious about the origin of minds in human beings, of my own mind, for many decades, and have done a great deal of reading and direct exploration. And I've had experiences that were astonishing and unexpected in those explorations. Some experiences that I've never really heard anything alike with. There are questions about whether minds are distinctly located, quote unquote, in separate beings. There are questions about what it would look like if we were not, what would happen to a human being if it was not socialized, raised in culture, and we have some modest examples of that phenomenon. There are questions about the nature of mind. And many of these questions wow. have been pursued by philosophers and by people engaged in spiritual or meditation traditions. And there's plenty of material for us to examine that's been produced by brilliant women and men throughout history. And it's not my purpose here to review that material, though I will acknowledge it. This magnolia is being tended primarily by bumblebees and the occasional wasp, yellow jackets. Looks like evidence of a bird kill here. So one of the things a mind can do is integrate the input from awareness to produce a novel insight, or to produce a derivation. Some people might call it an abstraction. Wonder why this area is closed off. There's no apparent reason. So I see on the ground a bunch of feathers. Well, not a huge bunch. Let's see if we can survey this area here. So there's a few over there. There's some here, some here, some here, some there. There's some tiny feathers and some larger feathers here. A variety of feathers. And it could be that this is the result of preening. But I think there are too many feathers, and feathers of different types, for it to be merely preening. And since I know that a number of raptors, raptors are very common here in the gardens, and I've seen kill sites before, my suspicion is that that is a place where a raptor consumed another bird. Now, the ability to integrate sensory data and produce concepts and to imagine things, and to do this in an organized way so that it's not merely incoherent or chaotic or psychotic or delusional, is evidence of what we generally refer to as a mind. And we think of it, we're taught to think of minds as a localized possession of an individual organism. And this way of thinking about minds emerges from habits of discriminating that we are taught and that are reinforced in our culture, in the cultures that we belong to. So that we are taught to think of separable entities, and of these entities possessing qualities or assets or faculties, as though the beings were containers, right? The metaphor is that, the metaphor at play here is that a human being is a container, and the container, oh yeah, there's more feathers over here. So now my theory has been validated because there are massive amounts of feathers all around here. This is a little bit distant from where the first feathers were. I don't recognize these feathers, though they could belong to a pigeon, and pigeons are fairly common targets for hawks here. But these feathers are gray they're much like this one. Yeah. And so my initial suspicion has pretty much been validated. There's a very good chance that this is a kill site. There are feathers all over the place here. This is a little bit distant from where I first encountered a small amount of feathers, and there's feathers everywhere here. So I have I've traveled, and this is another metaphor, right? I've traveled in my mind and physically traveled on the terrain in such a way that my initial suspicion was validated, or appears to be validated. There are certainly other possibilities. There are possibilities other than that a raptor killed and ate a bird. But there's fecal deposits here and lots of stuff that implies to me a raptor kill site. And this is an example of part of how humans use the faculties that we encompass with the term mind. It's not clear whether I'm not sure I trust the idea that a mind is a possession, though I understand and can use the language comfortably. In fact, I'm inclined to contest, or suspend is another word that I prefer, many of the assertions about consciousness, awareness, intelligence, mindedness, language, culture, and so on that we are exposed to throughout our lives. Almost all of us undergo a relatively long process of at least modestly formal enlanguaging and enculturation as children. And before those processes become relatively complete, although they continue throughout our lifetimes, we experience other kinds of, we experience the precursors to what will become our familiar experience of mental activity. Those precursors are capable, they're really quite profound. I believe that they have a lot to do with our dreaming, the dreaming aspects of our mental interiority. And I also believe they undergo a process where they are, and again this is a metaphor, where they become occluded or buried under layers of relatively formal representational behaviors and habits that we are trained to engage in and to emulate by our exposure to adults, to culture, to literature, to television, to computers, and so on. the topics here are very rich and deep because they go to the core of our waking and dreaming experience. And there are so many branches. So one of the branches that fascinates me and that I encourage those of you who are interested to explore in your own way is a kind of historical anthropology of human consciousness. These studies are concerned with the development and transformation of human consciousness and mental faculties over long periods of our history. There are books such as The Discovery of the Mind by Bruno Snell and the very peculiar and fascinatingly complex, richly imagined book, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes. A very controversial and amazing tour de force, which certainly gets some things wrong, and gets others perhaps astonishingly. The implications of Jaynes's book are profound and worth pursuing. Let's put it this way. And there's another book that I'll mention briefly because of its profound implications for our relationships with language, representational thought, and the nature of the actual mechanical functions of how we use language, though there are many astonishing books on this topic. One that had a profound effect on me was a book by an ostensible madman who was also a genius, Alfred Korzybski, who wrote 2 books, I think between the 30s and 50s. I think one was called Manhood of Humanity, a book I've not yet read. And the other book is called Science and Sanity, which is a very complex and astonishing book about problems with our relationships with language. So, each of us experiences from the onset, from the dawn of our own emergence into physical awareness as infants, or maybe even as embryos, though we can't really talk to embryos to find out what's going on with them, and it's fairly difficult to talk to infants, yet we can observe phenomenon that help us to understand that they're having some kind of experience of relatively coherent interiority, mentalistic phenomenon. So each of us have undergone an evolution of consciousness, which I am inclined to speculate may well recapitulate, locally recapitulate the milestones that our species underwent over long periods of historical time. So let us say 50,000 years. Yeah. Except that human beings 20 or 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 years ago never traversed the terrain of formal representational cognition that has been the primary activity of our species over, say, the last 1,500 or 2,000 years. that terrain was not yet established in the human pool of mental interiority, the totality of which, the body, that human pool, that body of which I refer to as our Cogniscium. Yeah, the human Cogniscium. The pool of living minds on Earth at any one time, or possibly over some given span of time. I refer to this as the Cogniscium. And the transports between minds in the Cogniscium I refer to as the mimula. And we presume largely that all of those transports are physical. In other words, there are no non-physical transports between human minds. Meaning, you can't know what's in my mind, and I can't know what's in your mind. If we accept this as a fact, it would be impossible to know that without some physical transaction taking place, which could include very subtle things like pheromones, or bacteria. But essentially, there are sort of two primary schools of thought, though they're not the only ones. One is all communication between human minds has to have a physical transport of some kind. Another is that there are non-physical transports, either metaphysical transports or paraphysical transports, pre-physical. I think there's going to be a lot of noise over here for a minute, so I may have to turn around. So yes, most people who think about these things, or many people who think about these topics, they choose one of these two paths. Either there's physical and non-physical, the kinds of things we might normally refer to as psychic or telepathic or this kind of thing. Or there's just physical, right? You got to have some kind of physical transport for there to be sharing of information between locally possessed minds. Now again, that presumes that the minds are locally distinct, right? That my mind is sort of in the container of my body, and yours similarly. And everyone's, the animals, if they have minds, are contained in their bodies. And that's not the only model, by a long shot. Now, I'm suddenly realizing that this topic's so deep that I may have to preempt my other planned topic of the originary intelligences with which we acquire our complexly endowed human consciousness. Yeah. So I'm going to have to preempt that topic because the topic that I'm playing with is too rich by itself. So I may return to that at another time, but I want you to hold it in your mind that whatever it is with which we acquire that which becomes our human intelligence and mindedness may be superior to the thing we acquire with it that largely hides it forever from our access and awareness. Most people would think, well, the intelligence of an adult human is certainly preferable to that of an infant. Yet the intelligence of the infant can acquire an astonishing spectrum of mental faculties, behaviors. My goodness. There's one of the raptors that I was speaking about earlier. Yeah, the potentials that a human infant brings to their human birth are staggeringly endowed to be able to acquire and match almost anything, any kind of culture a child is born into. Whether they're born in China or Japan or, India or Kazakhstan or Afghanistan or Israel or Palestine or the United States or Canada or Venezuela. They can acquire both the languages, the cultures, the mental habits, traditions, and behaviors of a people. They can probably even acquire things from animals if they are raised among them. It would be fascinating to see a human child raised among pods of dolphins, for example, or something we ordinarily wouldn't think of, prides of lions, or gorillas, or chimpanzees, or a pack of dogs, wolves, coyotes. There have been children who apparently were lost in the wilderness and may have been socialized among, for example, dogs, wild dogs. But there are very few of these, and I think our perspective on them is likely to be confused. In any case, hold in your mind this idea, if you will, that prior to imprinting in infancy, our children are possessed of an astonishingly sophisticated array of uptake faculties that we rarely have a chance to imagine or discuss. And that once these uptake faculties have been imprinted, they recede into the deep background of consciousness and are thus no longer available to us. The corvids are also extremely social organisms in their way. So, we undergo imprinting, each of us uniquely, and we develop certain affinities for various aspects of this imprinting. Some of us become voracious readers of books, others watchers of films, others become computer programmers, doctors, lawyers, gas station attendants, cooks, dishwashers, mothers, fathers, psychologists, therapists, physicists, mathematicians, documentary filmmakers, philosophers, spiritualists, religious people. There's all these branches within the cultural milieu that we will each choose, and we're not perfectly free to choose, because our contexts, the contexts into which we were born and within which we are raised, will deeply influence the results of our enlanguaging and our enculturation. And I don't think it's either nature or nurture. It seems to me to be a mix of both. While the context matters a great deal, children also have uniquely personal, they appear to display uniquely personal affinities and disaffinities that will radically affect this process of forming what we call a mind. And it should be clear that whether the primary aspect of mind is locally possessed or not, and I'd like to suggest at least that we be capable of thinking of something a bit more like a receiver and transmitter than a localized library. The bees that we observed in the beginning of this video briefly represent a unique aspect of a metaphor of mind that exists in nature, where the bees cross gaps between flowers. And in so doing, they connect those flowers, but they also produce a kind of superposition which can be understood as the honeycombs. Yeah. And those are food, but they are also a kind of memory, right? They are storage, in a way, for the processed results of their interactions with flowers. And they also they produce many other products as well. They carry pollens. They make a kind of glue that can be used to build things. They produce all kinds of things. And the ones that humans have distinguished with language must probably be only the very most obvious things that the bees are doing and produce, because this is how our relationship with knowledge tends to work. We'll see the very obvious things first, and then over time, perhaps we will acquire greater sophistication in discriminating between the elements of a thing, something we can distinguish. And we constellate those elements, just as we think of our bodies as a collection of organs. However, do we put the precedence on unity or distinction? This is an important question when we think about minds. Is there a shared domain from which all minds emerge? And when we look at culture and language that humans preserve and transmit to their children, knowledge, terms, concepts, models, explanations, descriptions, predictive heuristics, and so on, then we can see that there is some external force that we might say, if we were being generous, fertilizes the precursors that exist in children to produce the complexly in language and enculturated minds that are the hallmark of our common experience moment to moment while we're awake. And also produce many of the aspects of our experience when we're dreaming. So some large portion of our experience depends on input from without. Whether that input is news and media and common conversation. We listen to the conversations of adults as children. This helps us learn language. We're very interested in acquiring their attention and concern and awareness. And that's part of how the enlanguaging process succeeds. Alfred Korzybski refers to the transmission of these assets to each new generation, if I've got this correct, as time binding. And he suggests that this is one of the primary things that distinguishes the human animal from other obviously intelligent social animals on Earth, is that we are time binders. And it's an interesting theory. It's not the only thing. It's not the only interesting model that I've heard, but it's a useful one. And it's not the only interesting model that I've played with. Yet humans appear to be very unique in terms of our relationship with what I'll call formally representational cognition. That is, we represent experience in concepts, language, and models within or with our mental interiority, within what we call our minds. And this process, here's where things become very interesting to me, although all of this is interesting to me. This process involves memory, what we refer to as memory. And there are different kinds of this. So for example, it's not impossible to think of a concept that we've been exposed to from biology, the concept of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, that encodes, apparently, this is the model we use, that encodes the physical development and many aspects of behavioral inclination for organisms, particularly animals. So this can be understood as a kind of physically transmissible form of memory, if we wish to think of it that way. That's not the only way to think of it. But I'm going to speak primarily about, and by the way, it's not just DNA that we transmit. And when a human being arises, it's not just animal DNA that's involved. I learned long before it was a common topic in science that we're also, our character and abilities and potentials are dramatically affected by the transmission of bacterial symbionts. which are probably in turn affected by viral symbionts. And there are trillions of these in our bodies, so about half of our cells are bacterial, which means it's not animal DNA, it comes from the world. And some of these are transmitted to us by our family members that we have contact with, but others are transmitted by contact with the soil, with animals, with insects, with disease, and so on and so forth. So it's a very, very complex environment in terms of how our DNA acquires structure over time. And I think we're in the very early days of understanding this, even though, all appearances aside, right? But what I want to talk about, and it may be difficult to separate these things because clearly our animal cells and our bacterial symbionts and the contexts in which we exist and have relationships all are have a generative or an inhibitive effect on what I want to speak of as our mental memory. The thing I want to say first is that memory in human beings is not merely storage. It's a complex, ambiently, actively transforming faculty. It's the basis of most of our mental faculties. We might have awareness of like hot or cold or hunger or not, but we wouldn't be able to call them anything unless we had memory and language and concepts. Or memory of language and concepts, excuse me. The ancient Greeks, the scent of these flowers is incredible. They deified memory as Mnemosyne, the mother of the muses. And there are different numbers of muses and types of muses, but her children represent the arts of mentalistic behavior. When I encountered the feathers, my ability to integrate that into a coherent imaginal explanation depended on me being able to refer to layers and layers of previously acquired, coherent, accessible experience, descriptions, models, words, all of these things. Now, another model of memory, one of the models that humans, we love metaphors, right? So we metafy all of the most important concepts, and one of the common metaphors for memory, again, it's usually metaphysed as something I contain, right? I'm a container, and within that container is a mind, and an aspect of that mind is memory. But one of the models of memory, one of the metaphors for it is that of a library. Yeah. And in our modern experience, this has become somewhat confused with the internet. Now, it should be clear that our own development of minds is related to exposure to networks in general. And the internet is an abstraction, a derived abstraction, an often mispurposed abstraction of the networks that we've established and participated in. The internet is a physical instance of what I earlier referred to as the mimula, right? The collection of transports between human minds. Yeah? And anything that can control that can profoundly affect the results of human enlanguaging, enculturation, and mental activity. if you can control the mimula, you can profoundly influence the results of what humans do with minds. And this is a great danger in our time, something I'm very concerned about. But in essence, we might suggest, I don't want to assert it and say that this is a fact, but we might suggest that all of what we think of as mind activity, mental activity, is fundamentally related to doing things with memory, to recalling something, which, by the way, transforms it. It's not merely retrieval. You can't touch something in mental space and not affect it. So recalling things to mind, which is required for me to even be able to have the ability to speak in this way, in a way that is coherent and hopefully comprehensible and maybe even possibly somewhat entertaining, if I'm lucky, or skillful, requires me to be constantly retrieving in a relatively rapid way not just the words that I'm speaking, but also the frameworks that allow me to compose spoken language on the fly. And this is an incredibly sophisticated array of skills that we have the opportunity to acquire to varying degrees, depending on where we are born and the contexts in which we are immersed and what we are exposed to and what we have affinities for and what we have disaffinities for, and so on and so forth. So in this moment, as I'm attempting to reflect on the nature of memory, I have to use all these different features or distinguishable features of playing with that upon which I hope to reflect meaningfully. But memory is not merely storage, and our exposure to computers, I think, has created the potential for vast misunderstanding about the nature of intelligence, consciousness, cognition, memory, imagination, and so on. Our minds are not computers, in the same way that our hearts are not merely pumps. Okay? And when, there's all kinds of arguments around this. But I will speak from my own understanding and experience. Our minds are to computers what charred matchsticks are to the sun. Yeah. What computers do is a merely mechanical process. Minds cannot be a merely mechanical process. And many brilliant mathematicians like Kurt Gödel and philosophers have explored this topic deeply. David Bohm is one of them. And realized that whatever our minds may be, they cannot merely be mechanical processes. And mechanical processes cannot be minds unless we change the meaning of mind, unless we throw away some, perhaps, 80 to 90% of what minds actually are and do, which one of the things they are is alive, by the way. We can't compare minds and machines, and we shouldn't. And this is one of the dangers of language. Language can lead us into false comparisons, metaphors that are clearly either overtly wrong or actively toxic. And the idea that what machines do can be intelligence is one of these ideas. It's a transformation. It's a very dangerous transformation of the constellation of ideas that the term intelligence naturally refers to. So memory is not merely storage, but it underlies all of our It underlies the potential of all of the faculties upon which our common mental experience and activity depend. Change memory, transform memory, you transform those faculties. Damage memory, you damage those faculties. Improve memory, you improve those faculties. And I would argue, for example, that a person who speaks multiple languages has a very different experience of not just linguistic cognition, but also of identity, because they can triangulate from multiple points of reference, and each of the terms for a thing will naturally acquire unique connotations in each language. And connotation is one of the most astonishing aspects of our relationship with linguistic memory. Although most of us are aware that words have definitions, they have denotations. The tree denotes these glorious organisms. But it also has connotations. We have adopted tree-like structures to process language and information. And if one graphs a sentence in English, this becomes immediately apparent. But prior to the onset of English in ancient languages, in some languages, individual letters have an extremely complex tree-like structure, in part because they have spellings, like in Hebrew. Aleph is spelled Aleph Lamed Pei, but Lamed has a spelling, and Pei has a spelling. And so a single letter in Hebrew can have an astonishingly complex internal structure, and this is something that our modern languages have lost. But what I wanted to focus on was that terms in English and other languages don't merely have something they denote, they have things they connote, things that are associated with them in our own heart or experience, in our own mental interiority. So that, for example, we have colloquialisms such as free as a bird, so that birds have the connotation of liberty, they have liberation. And flight has the connotation of freedom. And then there are sociocultural connotations that we acquire, which structure our linguistic and conceptual memories. But then there are also personal ones, connotations that each of us have acquired during our lifetime. So if, for example, I ask someone to reflect upon something very deeply intimate and physical, such as, say, kissing, that will be uniquely connotated for them and may involve imagining previous relationships or experiences of kissing, their first kiss, feelings and sensations that are oriented with it, and perhaps events, right? Circumstances, situations, things that happened to them or didn't happen with them. So that any idea or concept that catalyzes our memorial activity, right, can produce astonishingly sophisticated effulgences from effulgences of memory. If I begin to imagine something that happened with my first pet, my imagination will come alive, and an aspect of my mental interiority will begin to do something not entirely unlike dreaming. In fact, what do we really mean by imagination? Memory is a precursor to imagination and is one of the fundamental assets that is required to produce imaginal experience. And when I look around me here, what I'm seeing reminds me of physically instanced memory. These forms. These are like walking through the physical metalog of memory. Now, we imagine that memory also is stored, even though it isn't merely storage. We imagine that it's stored, and we imagine, we're trained to think that it's stored in the brain. That's certainly not the only place that it's stored, if it is stored. And storage is again kind of a weird metaphor, because anytime we do anything with memory, it changes. It's got a fluid aspect. And one of the things that we have to do in order to maintain our memories as we grow and change and as we get older is dream. Dreaming, for reasons we don't yet have a clear grasp on, structures is crucially involved in structuring and preserving memory, and also in imprinting, which we might call storage, but I think we'd be making kind of a mistake, because to store has the connotation of just taking a thing and putting it somewhere so that it can later be retrieved in the same form, essentially, that it was placed into storage. And yet we have experience of things that, when they are put away, quote unquote, transform, right? And we have experiences of places in which we can put things that transform them. The idea of cooking a meal is one of them. The idea of aging a commodity that becomes more valuable with time is another. But I don't believe our memories are merely storage. I think they're alive. I think they're transforming, like we are. They're made of living stuff, and we can't really locate that stuff. We can, neuroscience is still pretty young. We can do things with the brain, we can do things to the brain that lead us to believe that, these kinds of memories are stored here and there, and if we damage this tissue or that tissue, we can damage memory. If we stimulate this tissue or that tissue, we can, memorial imaginations will emerge. And that's very interesting. And I'm by no means wish to dismiss that. And yet, that doesn't tell us that that's all that's going on, or that's only what's going on. Somehow, to be human is to participate in field phenomenon, and our acquisition of language and knowledge and enculturation, and even our ability to structure memory, depends in part on our participation in fields. What would a human infant become if not exposed to those fields? It's very important, this question, when we're thinking deeply about topics like memory and mental activity. Now, much of what comprises a mind is really an array of habits of accessing, examining, transforming, and relating with memory. So one of my points here is that what we mean by a mind is an array of behaviors that are ingrained in us over time, that we learn, that depend fundamentally on relating with memory. And we can imagine that if our memories were somehow to be destroyed, there would be very little mind-like activity, although we might still do some of the behaviors that we use to acquire the precursors that will be stored and transformed in memory. We might still do some of that, it would just fail all the time. It wouldn't produce its ordinary results if our memories were no longer functional or were, unavailable to us. So awareness isn't the same thing as mindedness. As I said, we can be aware of hot or cold or things like this without having any real mental activity or need to have a picture or a description or a name or anything like that. When we think of minds, we tend to think of consciousness. Although it's important, I believe, to include dreaming and maybe even to see our waking minds as a peculiar subset of something that's even something that is mysterious. If we make a big circle and call this like the mystery, we make a littler circle in there and call this dreaming and imagination, and then we make a smaller circle in there, well, no. Where do you put the mind? You put it outside of dreaming and imagination, or you put it inside dreaming and imagination in this model? I'm not sure. But all of these things are deeply related. And to imagine, or even to try to remember something, is in a way related, in my view, to dreaming. There's a question of what has precedence, right? Does imagination have precedence to dreaming, or does dreaming have precedence to imagination? It's an open question. I can think of arguments for kind of either side depending on what my purpose is. But because our mindedness is an array of learned habits and behaviors, it can be radically transformed in a number of ways. It can be intentionally transformed by exploration and learning and creativity on our own part. And creativity is a crucial factor there. It's non-trivial. But it's also transformed and affected by our exposure to culture and context. And most of the culture and context in which many of us are engaged is relatively toxic, I think. It's unfriendly to the underpinnings of memory, imagination, creativity, intelligence. It's unfriendly to life. And it's very coercive. And much of the culture to which we're exposed is mind narrowing, and if I may be so bold, kind of soul killing. It's not the vast results of our modern supercultures are very dangerous, in my view. And thus we may see a radical uptick in the incidence of problems that we associate with damage to memory. Problems like dementia and Alzheimer's, although that's a very peculiar topic because it's not entirely clear whether anything other than the genetic variant of that disease truly corresponds with that diagnosis, but that's a sophisticated topic. My main point is that as we offload features that would have been living within our minds to machines for the sake of convenience, we are losing access to some of the originary faculties that contribute to memory and imagination and creativity and intelligence. And that process seems to be a cascade with ongoing developmental repercussions that are largely very negative. Ancient philosophers were deeply concerned about the onset of writing because prior to the onset of writing, knowledge had to be transmitted orally. In other words, the mimula, the physical mimula, was primarily oral, the connection between minds. And because it was oral, it contained the living music of living voices like this recording does. Those voices went silent when writing became possible. And over time, the unimaginably sophisticated oral and song traditions of ancient peoples were lost because they could not successfully compete against the capacity to record and store ideas, knowledge, and stories in codes, in written code, in writing. Now, writing is a profoundly astonishing capability for an animal to have. But it's not all upside. And most of the cognitive and technologies that emulate cognition that we've developed over time have very severe downsides that we've not, that as a people, as a species, we're not examining intelligently. In fact, we may not yet possess the tools to understand what we refer to as advancements in culture. And it seems to me that as these advancements occur, something else is declining, right? It's not just writing is an advancement as it's usually presented, because the onset of writing heralded the death of oral culture. And that was a catastrophic loss. And one that cannot be amended. We cannot resolve that loss. What's gone from the oral traditions is largely gone forever, and particularly from the song traditions of ancient peoples, but also from their oral linguistic traditions. The encounter with writing transforms minds, it transforms language. And so too does our relationship with machines in general, and particularly with the capacity to electronically store, transmit, view, share, pay attention to data objects on screens. Now, I would argue that many of these technologies, especially our transmission technologies, are abstractions of mental experiences and behavior that we had access to long before their onset. So I would argue that long before we had radio, there were nonverbal, apparently non-physical transmission and reception assets associated with human minds and human mental experience. In other words, telepathy. I've experienced and seen many situations and circumstances that convince me, personally, I'm not trying to convince you, that there are non-physical transports in the mimula between human minds, and they are not merely the results of, that would still be physical. I was going to say information embedded in contexts and then retrieved from contexts. That's part of the mimula. But my point is just that I strongly suspect that what humans have tended to do with their technological advancement is to make derivations of previously experienced phenomenon for convenience. So before there was radio, there was something we participated in that was akin to direct mind-to-mind transmission over distance, and maybe an increase in distance produced an increased likelihood of this kind of transmission, right? And that before we had screens and televisions and computers and the internet, we used to dream together. We would be in each other's dreams and remember it. And I've had this experience with others. So I know, at least for myself, I know this to be possible. Our technologies are emulating faculties that are being subtracted from our common experience, opportunity, familiarity, from our developmental library. Yeah? And that is something I hope we can learn to amend together. That's part of why I'm concerned with this topic of, what is mental activity? What is the mind? There's something, again, that is to the internet what a galaxy is to a grain of sand. And I suspect that what we call our minds depends on contact and immersion in that, and on coherent relation with it, within that field. Now, I may be proven wrong. I'm not claiming my ideas are the best ones or the good ones or anything. I'm merely trying to share with you some of the results of my own exploration. And I'm interested in other perspectives and other opinions. And it may turn out that, though I very much doubt it, that all of the mimula, all of the transports between human minds are physical. There are no non-physical transports. But I think that extremely unlikely for all kinds of reasons. So one of the things that I'm deeply concerned about is that as we convert previously accessible and available forms of mental adventure, creativity, imagination, communication, insight acquisition, learning, as we transform these faculties into external, mechanically derived conveniences, we're losing access to them. And in fact, we may come in time to simply not believe they exist. No one who has directly experienced mind-to-mind communication will doubt that it exists. But people who've never experienced it have no reason to believe in any such thing. And there are a vast array of senses that are natural to our human form that are catastrophically inhibited, punished, reviled, denigrated, argued against in many of our modern contexts. And that's not the only problem. There's a separate problem, which is that bizarre sort of para-spiritual nonsense religions have proliferated to such a degree that there's ignorance on both sides of the divide, right? There's ignorance whether we say, for example, all communication between human minds has to have a physical transport. There's all kinds of nonsense on that side, including the idea that we don't actually have experience at all, that what we think of as our experience or even our mental behavior is largely kind of a byproduct of metabolic activity in the organ we call the brain. This is a pseudo-scientific idea that's popular among some particularly deranged people. Even if that were true, it couldn't be the brain by itself because the body exists. There's no brains in boxes, right? The body is a unity first, and the brain is an organ in that unity. So the entire unity has to be involved in mental phenomena and behavior and activity and experience. So there are people that think, there's got to be only physical transports in the mimula. There's nothing transphysical going on. And then there are people that are thinking there are nonsensically bizarre non-physical phenomenon for which they have extremely unbelievable explanations and descriptions. And one of the things I find interesting about this is that I know people who can directly demonstrate non-ordinary cognitive phenomenon. They can directly demonstrate and again, we have a two-sided problem here. So they can directly demonstrate what appears to be mind-to-mind communication. And some of them have really strange explanations and descriptions of how and why this is going on. And some of them have relatively more coherent ideas and explanations. But again, we have two sides of this phenomenon as well. So if someone can directly demonstrate mind-to-mind communication in some way, let's say they know something about an activity I did today that would be impossible for them to know and that I have not told them. The male great horned owl, there's a pair that hang out here during the sunset, and they're communicating at the moment. And I remember this because it made such a great impression on me when I first encountered it. And here's another aspect of memory, right? We become impressed. It's as if we collect impressions, and they transform each other within us and our minds and the capacities of our minds to be or do things. But in any case, back to my point, there are two kinds of people who can demonstrate something that resembles direct mind-to-mind communication. One of which is trustworthy and authentic, and another of which is an illusion. So there are people, for example, like what we call mentalists, and people like Darren Brown, who's a mind-manipulating performer. And one of Darren's claims, if I understand it correctly, is that telepathy and things like this can't be real because he can directly demonstrate phenomena that are more astonishing and that appear to be telepathic or psychic, yet are not. They are mechanical deceptions and misdirections. So certainly there are such things as like hypnotism and misdirection and mechanical misdirection, where it's possible to convince someone that non-physical mind-to-mind transmission has occurred, when in fact it can be demonstrated via the mechanical template that it hasn't. But the fact that there are mechanical deceptions does not mean that the thing they are presenting as an illusion cannot exist or does not exist. It simply means that we are capable of being deceived. But we're capable of being deceived about almost anything. So to me, this is an insufficient disproof of non-physical shared mental faculties. But again, the question's open. My perspective is that there's either a pre-physical domain that all minds participate in. Most of us think of metaphysics, the word meta means after, right? So it means beyond physical, but it could also mean before, right? I suspect that our experience of mindedness, of having a mind, of participating in consciousness and mental activity, depends on a variety of underlying relationships that have been rendered invisible by our species' long traverse into complex representational cognition, which includes things like mathematics and formal logic, rationality, reason, and so on. Now, all of those subproducts depend on our ability to imagine things. They depend on our ability to have sort of transcendental, partly incoherent, or not merely coherent, maybe metacoherent, mental behavior and activity and experience, like dreaming, for example. So even to determine whether a thing is logical or not requires something beyond mere logic. It requires that with which we look upon logic to determine whether the structure is trustworthy or not, and why. And we often refer to this as the imagination. And our imaging and transmission and movie making technologies, these are derivations of imagination, right? These are these are representations of imaginal experience, and they're very compelling. As you can see, they're extremely compelling to vast populations of people. Vast populations of us will spend huge amounts of our lives staring into screens with a look on our faces like we're in trance. And to entrance is, of course, the same word as entrance, just pronounced slightly differently, inflected differently. And those screens and the networks that connect them are a physical derivation of what I call the mimula, that which connects human minds. And I want us to think much more creatively and intelligently and purposefully about the human cogniscium, the sort of collective body of human consciousness and awareness, and the mimula, those transports that connect human minds and across which information or stimuli is transmitted and received. Because there's something very interesting going on here, and I'm not going to be able to more than hint at it today. But there are forces, or possibly something we might call entities, without necessarily meaning beings, but coherent recurrent structures that appear to be competing to dominate the mimula, the transports between human minds. And this is true even in a single human, in a single human being, if there is reasonably such a thing. If separation has enough precedence that we can meaningfully refer to an individual human being. Because if unity has precedence, then the distinction is drawn into question in very important ways. If in human mental activity unity has precedence over separation, and obviously it's the answer is going to be both, right? There are perspectives from which unity clearly has precedence, and there are perspectives from which distinction or separation clearly has precedence. So I think it's more than both, rather than being one or the other. And we are certainly habituated to refer to humans and think of them as individuals and think of their mental activity as something that is unique and personal and secret and local to them. Though less and less so today with the technologies that are effectively surveilling our moment-to-moment experience and activity, including our facial expressions and eye movements and perhaps heartbeats and pupil dilation and so on. It occurs to me that humans may represent a unique organ of memory and cognition in the family of living beings on Earth. That we may have forgotten an astonishingly sophisticated and beautiful and majestic role that whether or not we were developed to embody, we came to embody, and we have the potential to be. But this depends on the purposes for which we form and enact minds. It depends on the contexts in which we develop them. It depends on us having profoundly intelligent, nurturing, creative, playful, healthy contexts in which to develop and enact mental behaviors. And at present on earth, there are very few of these. But one of them is this place that I come every day. It is filled with organisms that to me they are the living embodiment. They're not representations. They're not abstractions. They're the living embodiment of the relational and organismal history of this world, and probably of time-space itself. They are the face of the origins of human minds and human bodies and intelligence. They are the ancestors of the unimaginably sophisticated potentials for intelligence that we bring to human birth. And when I walk in this garden among these anciently evolved beings and relationships, I begin to remember in a way that's not conceptual or verbal. I begin to remember the profound potential of my own nature as an organism, as a being, as a participant in the entire history of life on earth, as an expression of that history. And I feel called to recover and remember the incredible beauty and noble proclivities, potentials, and opportunities of our human incarnation. This is such an unimaginable adventure, and it's one in which I hope you will join me. We have forgotten so much of what it means to be human. And yet, thankfully, the living libraries from which our humanity takes its shape and nature are yet with us today. And I believe that we can return to the fountain of our origins and to the intelligences in nature and recover those faculties directly together. And this is an adventure that inspires me and gives me hope in a time when the shadows of our technological development vie for dominance and threaten to put an end to the anciently conserved ecologies and perhaps to many of the most fundamental features of our human nature, potential, intelligence, and opportunity. If we are to give meaningful answer to these problems, we must understand their origins and natures. And that's part of my goal in reflecting on them with you today. These conversations will continue. Thank you for joining me, for your patience and your participation, for your interest, and perhaps most of all, for your dreaming and your imagination.